According to Frank Gill, the author of our textbook, avian habitat lost is the single greatest threat facing avian species today. In the United States alone, we have lost 29% of our birds since 1970, according to an article from the New York Times. This could be due to any number of reasons. Again, as found in our textbook, we have seen examples that Gill uses are things such as losing old growth forests due to logging, um, urban development spreading out into what was once untouched prairie land or other habitats, draining of wetlands in order to increase agrarian land, etc. According to an article from Gaston et al., habitat loss reduces species diversity and carrying capacity of organisms that it can sustain. Now, this issue speaks deeply to just how much habitat matters. I know from personal experience working in waterfowl conservation that when you lose habitat, it does all kinds of, it wreaks havoc on ecosystems. Reason being, like in this article from Gaston, when you lose that habitat, you're losing niches within a larger habitat. Losing those niches leads to either the extinction or expulsion of a species of bird, likely due to one of a few reasons. Either those reasons being that there's just nowhere to live, which is the most obvious, and the loss of possible food sources. The loss of those food sources comes from, let's say, in draining wetlands, for example, you have all these microorganisms that live in ponds, in water sources, that are then consumed by larger organisms that are then consumed by waterfowl. Losing one piece of wetland can devastate an area. And globally, between 1990 and 2001, there has been a decrease by an estimated 12 to 36 billion birds globally. Much of this likely comes from the loss of the Amazon rainforest. As most of us know, the Amazon rainforest has been decimated in previous years. There is so much of this land that is being used to create ranches for cattle, to create agrarian land. While, yes, so that people can have jobs and make a better living for themselves, the impact of that is incredible. Just because the rainforest, as most of us know, being biology students, is the single greatest location for wildlife diversity on the planet. Losing any portion of a rainforest in decent enough numbers will simply devastate, obviously, devastate that area. The reason being is that, again, like in my previous argument, you lose with a larger ecosystem more niche ecosystems. That is going to end up echoing up and through the food chain and create many, many problems for many, many animals. Just a few threats that face, like I've already discussed, a few of these logging draining. So logging would be your deforestation. Um, Draining of wetlands due to farmers not wanting to deal with ponds in the middle of their farm fields, which for the most part is understandable. Urban development. So in the Twin Cities, we've seen suburbs pushing out farther and farther, expanding more and more as more people move into the suburbs or move from other states into Minnesota. I've personally seen this in my life, as when I grew up in the first half of my life, I watched what was essentially a grassland in my backyard become a housing development, losing who knows what. I don't, I can't even fathom what we've lost there. And agriculture links into both logging and the draining of wetlands. So, and I know this from working in water, in and around waterfowl conservation, is part of the issues that we face with waterfowl conservation is trying to get farmers not to drain the small 0.5 to 1 acre little ponds that pop up in the middle of their farm field or that already existed in the middle of their farm fields. The reason for this is that it offers a much more safe haven for waterfowl. Um, Many people think that wouldn't large bodies of water be better for waterfowl, and not necessarily, because small the more small ponds that you have that are around, the more spread out species can get, which leads to less competition, better breeding sites, and just overall a healthier population. Some of the solutions for this, for habitat loss in the United States specifically, that we can influence, would be creating economic or political incentives to keep habitats intact. This would include purchasing and designating lands as things like wildlife management areas, as national parks. Um, this is not something that we necessarily have direct influence in. It involves discussing things with your local politicians, getting them to increase funding to places such as the Department of Fish and Wildlife, asking for more state and national parks or expansion of currently existing states, natural parks, wildlife management areas, and the like. One of the things that we can do directly would be to avoid purchasing products such as beef and that we know use beef and leather specifically that come from South America, because the major deforestation going on in South America is to create ranches for cattle for beef and leather production. So trying to buy domestic beef and domestic leather products, while more expensive, does at least put a dent in growing profits from ravaging the rainforest in South America. This last point I got from discussing with my uncle, Dr. Matthew Clark, down at the University of Minnesota in conversations that we have had. He is in their Department of Horticulture, specifically doing plant genetics, if I recall correctly. And in discussions, he's talked about how if you're planting a garden, plant a prairie grass garden, I believe is how he referred to it, as your main garden. Don't use foreign plants. Domestic use domestic plant life, because that will in turn increase domestic insect and small animal life, microbe life, which will then in turn encourage avian species that feed or breed or nest in those areas to come back to that area because they have that small habitat. And if everybody would start to do that, we could see an increase in domestic species that we have previously lost, specifically in the prairie land aspects. These last two bullet points are probably the best that we have as far as possible solutions, because they are the ones that we influence directly by, again, purchasing animal products that come from South America, and just how we impact our households with how we set up our yards. Thank you for listening. I hope everybody has a great day.